Look, I can't thank you enough for joining us and sharing a little bit. And the last chat that we had when you shared with us on Thurgood Marshall was it was amazing, right? And such an amazing person, and then just to hear some of your context was really cool and inspiring for me, and I know the team really loved it. And obviously, this is a sort of a topical conversation, and for me, when I was thinking about it, like I just remember it was back in 2016, and we were hanging out up there at your place, actually, that whatever that was, February weekend. And I remember two things from that weekend. I remember that it was freezing cold. It was like minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. We were throwing boiling water into the air and letting it turn into snow. I remember that. And then I remember sitting around, maybe it had a drink or two, and your phone just started going nuts. And at some point you're like, what is going on? And then you picked up your phone, and that was when you had just this stream of text coming in that Justice Scalia had passed away.
Oh, wow. I didn't remember that was that weekend.
And what I remember about that was, like, I went right into my classically sort of, politically myopic state of like being cynical about it. And the first thing that you said was, oh man, I hope somebody's talked to Ruth. She's going to be devastated. And I think what was really amazing, and you shared their relationship and their friendship, which is something I knew nothing about. And it made me realize, like, the power of the court, and it is a different kind of institution. I think we live in such a polarized world, and especially in a year like this, right? It sometimes we don't realize how special that place is, and how special these people are. And so, I'm just really excited to have you here today to share a little bit with us all on some of your experiences and some of your background. And I'll hand it over to you and let you rip.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Wow, that's a great memory, because I had forgotten that was the weekend that Justice Scalia passed away. Well, it was a week ago, a week and a few hours less than a week ago, that my phone started blowing up again. With even more devastating news for me to hear that RBG had passed. Something that certainly I and many others had feared, because she's been dealing with cancer for many, many years now, including earlier this year. But in a way, I think we all got so inured to the existence of cancer in her body that, we just came to assume, well, she'll beat it again. She'll beat it again. She'll beat it again, because she always has. But she was 87 years old. And while her mind was still, more than 100% there, she was as sharp as ever. The body eventually gave out. And it's been a really sad week. And I went down for the memorial Wednesday into Thursday, and it's actually continuing today. And the reality of her passing didn't really hit me until on Wednesday morning. They had all her former law clerks line up in rows, socially distanced, in front of the Supreme Court. I don't know if you all have seen the images. It was pretty beautifully and theatrically orchestrated. We lined up, and then when I saw the hearse come into view driving down First Avenue in front of the Supreme Court, and seeing the hearse was when it really hit me in the gut, and I realized, my full body realized this is real. She's gone. And then they brought the casket into the court, and they had a very brief ceremony inside in which a rabbi gave a beautiful eulogy, a rabbi who was the spouse of a former Ginsburg clerk. And then Chief Justice Roberts gave a short but, just beautiful little address. And it was over in 20 minutes. And I commend to you those two eulogies, because they're worth reading or seen the videos of. And then they put the casket out under the portico, basically on the top of the stairs of the court. And for 2 days, there'd be an honor guard, the Supreme Court policeman right behind the casket, and then a clerk on either side. And you can see images of that. And we each did 20-minute shifts because, over the course of 40 years on the bench between the DC Circuit, where I clerked for her, and then the Supreme Court, she was a judge for 40 years. So it's a lot of law clerks, 159, I think someone told me. So, we had 20-minute shifts, and it was really powerful. Standing up there next to the casket, you could then see the lines of people waiting a long time to pay their respects by passing in front of the casket down at the bottom of the steps. They had to do it in a socially distanced way. But you could see, I'm standing there doing my best impression of a beefeater, trying not to move with the mask. But you can see people down at the bottom of the steps really moved. Mothers with children, fathers with children, couples of all ages, races, ethnicities. While some guy was across the street, I'll never forget this, just shouting with the clearest voice, Jesus saves, and then reciting the Lord, one of those surreal things. So as a little aside, when Donald Trump was loudly booed when he paid his respects in that same location and then claimed that he couldn't hear the boos, I thought of how I could hear one lone chanter from across the road. He could hear those boos and saying, people chanting, vote him out. But anyway, just an aside, it was really powerful to see how moved people were just to be in the presence of her casket. And I've been thinking a lot. It's really interesting to me. Everybody now knows the notorious RBG as she's come to be known. This meme that a law student at NYU created on Tumblr 7 years ago, and it's taken off. Not just the notorious RBG. A play on Biggie Smalls, the notorious BIG, but she's become a cultural icon. And this really only happened in the last 7 or 8 years, when she's already in her 80s. It's just bizarre. And what she's recognized for in these last 7 or 8 years is not just her role as the great dissenter, the leading liberal dissenter on a generally very conservative court, but she's also finally come to be recognized for her instrumental role back in the 1970s of leading the legal fight for equal rights for women. And I just don't get why it took till the 2000 teens for that to happen, when all that she did was in the 70s. And it's just, better late than never, but I still just don't understand why it took so long. Maybe it's a confluence of events that focus people's minds on this, but it's interesting. When I clerked for her back in the late 80s on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, so an appellate court for the federal government in DC, people used to say, you meet someone, I'd say, oh, who are you clerking for? And I'd say Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and they'd say, oh, that's nice, because her reputation was, she was a moderate, even conservative on some issues. She was actually opposed by a lot of women's groups when she was considered for the bench by Jimmy Carter, and then certainly when she was considered for the Supreme Court by Bill Clinton, because the perception was she was a moderate. She was not a liberal, and people thought, oh, she's very awkward to be around because she's very quiet. And many of you have probably seen others talk in interviews or read about her. You'd be having a conversation with her. Imagine an interview for a law student. You'd be interviewed for a clerkship, and you're sitting there, and she asks you a question, and you answer it, and then there's just silence. And you think, oh my God, I must have just said something really stupid, and she thinks I'm the biggest idiot she's ever met. And everybody's had this reaction. And then she'll ask you another question. And it's not, and some people just, they could not deal with that because they thought it was too intimidating, awkward. She was not, a backslapper in any way. But you eventually came to realize she was listening to what you had to say, and then she was formulating in her perfect, precise way exactly what she wanted to say next. And so it didn't necessarily mean you might have said something stupid, although I'm sure I did many times. But that was just the way she was. And, eventually most people who came to work with her got used to it and realized that was just part of her method, part of the way her incredible brain worked. But it's interesting that was the perception of her back then. And then even when she was put on the Supreme Court by Bill Clinton, for the first 20 years, she was a reliable liberal vote for the most part, but she certainly didn't achieve that great iconic status, legendary status that she has now. So just to maybe go back for those on the call who really aren't familiar with her strategy and her early role as an advocate, and maybe a little bit about her background too. She grew up in Brooklyn to a mother and father who were both immigrants from Europe. I can't remember if both were first generation or not. But in any case, her family was beset by tragedy sort of throughout her childhood. When she was, I think, 14 months old, her older sister died of meningitis. She didn't really recall her sister because she was too young, but she recalled the sadness that just imbued the home all her childhood because her parents had lost their oldest daughter. And then when she was in high school, her mother was stricken with cancer and ended up dying from cancer the day before Ruth, who was the valedictorian of her high school, James Madison High School in Brooklyn, was supposed to give the valedictory address, and her mom died the day before, so she obviously couldn't give the address. But she talks about how I think she found solace in books, and that's what made her such a diligent student and an academically minded person. She would talk about her mother would send her to the library, and the library was in her neighborhood was located above a Chinese restaurant. So whenever she'd smell or eat Chinese food, it would remind her of books and the library and how much she loved books, which I thought was just a great little memory. Then she went on to she got a full academic ride to Cornell, where she met her husband and the love of her life, and I'm sure many of you read about this couple, but it's really the greatest love story I've ever heard of. They were married for nearly 60 years, I think. But they actually got engaged while they were both still at Cornell, and got married when she was 21, and they ended up both going to Harvard Harvard Law School. He was a year ahead of her, I think. Now, I went to Harvard Law School too, and one of the reasons I wanted to go to Harvard was so I could continue to row, because I had a pretty short career at Princeton since I played football first, and so I wanted to keep rowing. And since I'm only 6 feet tall, I knew I had to switch to lightweight. So I was pretty proud of myself that my first year of law school I spent trying to row, going down to the boathouse, rowing with Charlie Butt, who was still training, even though he was a lightweight coach, losing 25 pounds, not eating, and then trying to stay awake in law school class. And then I did well enough to get these great clerkships with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Thurgood Marshall. So I thought, that's pretty cool that I was able to accomplish that while trying to do this other thing. Her story makes mine look like a piker's tale. It's just so insignificant. She goes to law school, and she has a baby while she's in law school. She's one of 8 or 9 women. Professors, there's a famous story about the dean, Erwin Griswold, a famous dean of Harvard Law, who had a tea with the 8 or 9 women and asked each of them to justify taking a spot of a man who could have been in that spot. And she has to deal with this kind of stuff. And she's got a baby. And then her husband, Marty, is stricken with testicular cancer while they're in law school. So she described what one of her days in law school was like. She'd be in school from 8 or 9 till 4. And they had a woman who would take care of her daughter, Jane, who's now a professor at Columbia Law School. She'd get home at 4, and then she said it was Jane's time until Jane went to sleep around 8 or 9 at night. And she just played with Jane. And then she'd hit the books, and she'd study deep into the night, which was a practice she continued until she passed away, working deep into the night. But when Marty was stricken with cancer, she had to add to that burden that he had friends who would take notes in lectures while he was in the hospital. And then she would spend hours typing up the notes for Marty so she could bring them to him in the hospital so he didn't have to drop out of school and he could read the notes. So she was getting by on, no sleep. And she manages to do incredibly well both years. Marty, is blessed to fully recover and graduates. He gets a job in New York, and so she transfers then to Columbia Law School. So despite all this stuff, and despite transferring, she ends up graduating Columbia first in her class. It's just mind-blowing stuff that she has such a huge brain that she could accomplish all this. And the work ethic, I've never met anyone who works or worked as hard as she did. So despite all this, finishing first in her class, she could not get a job because of the discrimination that women were confronted with back then. Could not get a job at a big law firm. Was interviewed by a couple of places, but she said, strike 1 was I was a woman. They didn't hire women. Strike 2, I was a Jew. They didn't hire Jews. Strike 3, I was already a mother. There's no way anybody was going to hire her with those 3 things. And she didn't get a job. And then for clerkships, she should have gone right to the Supreme Court as a law clerk. And Felix Frankfurter, a Supreme Court justice back then, supposedly asked somebody, well, does she wear a dress? Because I hate girls who wear pants. And despite being told that she wears dresses, he didn't take her anyway. She did end up getting a lower court clerkship with a judge that she worshipped from then on. But you can tell, the reason I'm telling all these stories in detail is because each step of the way in her life, there was tragedy that she overcame. There was discrimination that she didn't overcome right away, but she found her way. And I'll come back to that point. But, this was what life was like for someone who was trying to pursue a profession as a woman back in the late 50s and 60s, right on into the 70s. So she eventually gets a job. Columbia Law School wouldn't hire her, Fordham Law School, NYU, none of them would hire her. They didn't have women on the faculty. She gets a job at Rutgers. And while she's at Rutgers, she also starts working with the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and co-founds their women's rights project. And that's where sort of the story of Ruth the legend, RBG the legend, takes off, because she starts formulating the strategy and implementing the strategy in the Supreme Court to have the court start striking down federal laws that were clearly discriminatory based on gender. And not that many people, I think, were in this group, or maybe in the Marshall talk I gave, but Marshall was famous as an advocate for developing the strategy that struck down a lot of segregation and racially discriminatory laws in the U.S. And he was very careful in the way he went about it. Like with school desegregation, he very purposely didn't start with elementary schools or high schools. he started with law schools because he thought there'd be less resistance to integration when kids are older. There'd be much more sensitivity among white people to having their little kids. Oh, God forbid they go to school with a black child. So he was very methodical, and it was an incrementalist approach. Let's start with what should be the easier cases to win and do it that way. And RBG took a similar incrementalist approach, but if anything, her strategy was even more brilliant because what she did was take on these cases and bring these cases to the Supreme Court where the law actually seemed designed to give an advantage to women. So one of the laws, for instance, said that women were allowed to just by request get out of jury service. And the thinking behind that kind of law was, oh, well, they're needed in the home. They can't afford to be away from the home. Or a jury duty in a criminal case might be too much for, a frailer sex. There's this paternalistic thinking. And there were other laws that said, for instance, for military dependence benefits or Social Security benefits, that said that, for instance, the military benefits, the dependent of a male soldier, which is typically going to be a wife and a child, were greater or had fewer restrictions than the benefits that went to the dependents of a female member of the military. And so, you could say, well, that's a disadvantage to the male dependent. And so she took these cases with the purpose of getting 9 male justices on the Supreme Court to look at these things and see how a man was being disadvantaged when what she really wanted them to ultimately do was overturn these laws because they were based on this notion of paternalism. But if she just took on the paternalism directly, that might be considered an affront to these, sort of traditional male figures on the bench. And so she took these cases where, at least superficially, they seemed to be things that were working to the detriment of males, even though ultimately what they were doing was cementing this patriarchal view of women. And she ended up taking 6 cases to the court, or arguing 6 cases to the court. She had more that she was involved in as a friend of the court, and winning 5 out of 6 of them, which was just incredible. But that strategy is not really talked about enough, I think, because it was really so brilliant the way she thought of this and managed it, that it really deserves, if anybody's looking for a thesis topic, this is a good one. There's so many thesis topics you could come up with RBG. So that, then after that in 1980, when she made this name for her, Jimmy Carter put her on the DC circuit, and then eventually Bill Clinton put her on the Supreme Court. And I was talking to some of her current crop of clerks at the memorial, and I was asking them what was she like, before she got sick in the last couple of weeks. And even though they were working remotely, and so that these clerks were deprived of the experience of working physically proximate to her, what they described was very similar to what I described she was like in law school. She would work deep into the night with a stale cup of black coffee on this. She always had this little hot plate to keep her coffee warm, no milk or anything. That must have been the foulest coffee, but that's what kept the motor running. And she would work on drafts till 3, 4 in the morning, and the clerks would wake up at 6, 7, 8 in the morning, and there'd be a totally marked up draft, waiting for them to then implement her changes. And right through August into September, she was still working like that. 87 years old. I mean, the physical rigors that she endured. I mean, the RBG workout has become a sort of running joke on Saturday Night Live and on some of the late shows. And I don't know if some of you have seen the videos of her workout. doing planks and stuff, wearing a sweatshirt that says Born Diva or something like that. And I think she was not a workout person when I clerked for her. I think she knew she needed to keep the body going, as the vessel for that great mind. And so she started working out in her 80s, maybe her 70s or 80s, maybe 70s, but I think 80s. Every couple of days with this trainer, who I couldn't figure out a way to show you the video, but you can find it on Twitter. She's lying in state today in the Capitol building. They moved the casket from the court to the Capitol, and there's this great video going around of her personal trainer, who's this big, burly, muscular court policeman who also trains on the side. And he comes into her casket today in the Capitol dome, where she's the first woman ever to lie in state. Quite something that it's taken this long. And he knocks off a couple of push-ups, perfect form, as a way of honoring their time together. And let me just tell one other story about just a personal example of what I've seen of the way this frail looking woman, stooped, tiny, maybe weighed 90 pounds, soaking wet, had the physical fortitude that would just blow you away. 2 years ago, she had what turned out to be the last clerks reunion at the Supreme Court. And back in the old days, clerks reunions, when there were not that many clerks, they were very casual affairs in somebody's back, like a law clerk's backyard. We'd wear shorts and have a barbecue, and they were really nice. But once she became on the Supreme Court, it's a much more formal affair. But 2 years ago, she decided to do something even bigger, which was make it a whole weekend and not just have the 150 some odd former clerks and not just their spouses or significant others, but their children as well. And the occasion it was her 25th year on the bench. It was her 85th birthday. And I think she had a feeling that, this might be the last one. So, and I'm reading into it, but, I think I'm right about this. I think she wanted to give us all her gift, her extended family. She referred to our kids as her grand clerks. She wanted to give us this gift of 2 days with her, with our kids. So it was June of 2018. So I drove down with our kids and our au pair at the time. And, I never missed one of these things, so I know how they go. So I made sure we were right there, right when the doors opened, so that we could go and spend some quality time with her while everybody else was sort of just, getting their 10, 20, 30 minutes into it. Because I knew it was going to be crowded. And so I'll show you some pictures. But so we got to spend some nice time with her. And then very quickly, there was suddenly a line of at least 300, 400 people. And it was like a receiving line at a huge wedding in, the inside of the Supreme Court. And while we were, chatting with other former clerks and whatnot, she stood in the line and greeted every family for over 2 hours. By the time she had greeted everybody, it was time to go. They started to kick us out of the court. And I think she just felt like that was her duty. That was the whole point of this. This was the day when it was just for the families. The next night there was like a formal dinner. But I think she saw this as something she wanted to give back to those who had served her. And it was the most remarkable thing to see her stand there. I couldn't stand for 2 hours. My back would freeze. You'd have to carry me out of there. 2 hours of standing in one place. At 20 minutes standing by her casket was painful. 2 hours at least. And I noticed in the midst of this, another thing that's funny about her is she liked her white wine. And there was one of the State of the Union addresses that she attended, she nodded off, and people talked about this on Twitter and stuff. And she was interviewed, and someone said, "Did you fall asleep there?" And she said, "Yes, several of the justices and I went out to dinner before the State of the Union, and perhaps I imbibed a bit too much. So she never imbibed too much, but she did like her white wine. But I noticed I stuck my head into the hallway where she was still in this receiving line. I thought, oh my God, not only is she not standing there, nobody's thought to bring her a glass of wine. So probably my greatest service to her was to get a glass of wine and bring it to her. The smile on her face, I will never forget. She was so appreciative. But that's just a little funny vignette. But just the physical endurance of someone at that age after 5 bouts of cancer to hang on. And she just wanted to make it a few more months. And as I'm sure you've read, she on her deathbed, she recited something to her granddaughter, Clara. I'm paraphrasing, but it's something to the effect of it's my fervent wish that my successor will be named by the next president, something like that. So she was trying to hang on, and she just couldn't quite make it that long, which is tragedy for the country. But I don't want to dwell on the politics too much. I'm happy to answer questions about that. But I just wanted to share some of the history of her, some personal anecdotes, just to give you a little flavor of her. And I'll just show a few pictures just to go along with some of those stories here, if I can make this work. Let's do this one. Are you seeing this screen of her as a little kid? Yeah, okay. All right, so this is Ruth. I'll tell you something most people don't know. This is another thing she shares with Thurgood Marshall. Neither of them was known by their birth name. RBG's birth name is actually Joan. Thurgood's was Thorogood. He legally changed it because he thought it was easier to say Thurgood. But anyway, this is little Joan Ruth Ginsburg at 2, so shortly after her older sister died. This is Ruth and Marty at Cornell when they're 21. Marty's probably 22. I just love this. It actually reminds me of a picture of my mother and stepfather at my wedding. Just the love in this picture really captures this remarkable love story. Read what you can about these two, because it was really remarkable. It's also interesting about who she was, because he was famously the cook in the family. He actually made himself into quite a fancy chef, and she would joke about how horrible a cook she was, and she was banished from the kitchen. But she talked about how they took turns, basically, one taking the back seat to advance the other's career. So when he got a job in New York, she changed law schools. But then later in life, he was the force behind her getting named to the Supreme Court. He started a campaign. It's not like any liberal equivalent of the Federalist Society or something that was backing her. It was her husband, Marty, that got everybody that he knew to call the White House and say, you should put my wife on the bench. So, she lived what she preached. And they did, in terms of equality of their relationship. Greg, you talked about Justice Scalia. It's something that I think is wonderful. I couldn't do it. They had the most diametrically opposite views on every legal issue. If she wrote a majority opinion, he would write these famously blistering dissents talking about how crazy her opinion was. She adored this man. He made her laugh. She was not someone known for her laughter. He made her laugh. So this picture is actually mentioned in the Chief Justice's eulogy. This picture of them both on probably one of those judicial boondoggles where you get invited to speak in the summer at some foreign law school, and they rode on this elephant. And she was asked afterward by some former colleagues from the women's rights movement, why'd you let him ride in front? And in Ruth's very precise way, she said, well, the seating was chosen by the, I guess you call him the jockey, for purposes of weight distribution. She was a famous lover of opera, so much so, and so famously so, that she and Justice Scalia got to serve as extras in the Washington Opera, which probably made her happier than pretty much anything could. This is when she was named to the Supreme Court, welcomed by Chief Justice Rehnquist, whom she came to get along with pretty well on the court, which was very interesting because if you look through those 6 cases when she was an advocate, I think he joined the majority in her favor only once. I could be wrong about that, but I remember just looking through them again to get a sense. And he was oftentimes the only dissenter or the lead dissenter. He was not a big advocate for women's rights or racial equality, but she came to get along with him just fine. I think I might have mentioned that, he was no advocate of racial equality either, but Justice Marshall used to call him Chiefy Baby. So people had a way of getting along. This is the official portrait, which was standing next to the casket during the ceremony. I think it's a beautiful portrait. It's a little bit somber for my taste, but I think it's a beautifully done portrait. I had to get a shot of Thurgood's because this one I really like. Just because he's happier. Although he rarely looked like this when we talked to him. He was usually more gruff. And this is the clerk's reunion. This is before she had to stand that receiving line. So I think my older kids remember this. The little ones don't, but they'll always have this picture to treasure. So and I will too. And Jojo did not like that portrait of Chief Justice Rehnquist, and now you know why. And Justice Ginsburg was also famous for starting to wear these operatic accoutrements with her robes. That little collar, it's called a jabot. Some people now call them dissent collars. And so when we had this, because this reunion was also for the kids, they had this jabot station where the kids could make their own jabot. And that's my eldest daughter, Anastasia, wearing her jabot. All right, so let me stop sharing. So that's what I prepared. I'm sure I skipped a lot of things I wanted to talk about because there's just so much, and I don't want to bore you guys forever. But please ask me questions because I'd really love to just have a conversation with people. And this is your chance to ask me anything you want.
So there are a couple people that had actually sent me some questions in the private chat. Feel free to go ahead and just ask those questions yourself. Don't be shy. So if you want to hop on in, go for it.
Hey, Vat.
Hey, Mike.
Hey there. Great. Again, so sorry. I knew what the impact she had on you, and just seeing that photo with you and the family is just that's an incredible thing. And you shared a lot of details that I certainly didn't know about. So so thank you. But I had just one question, and of course, what's on everyone's mind right now. I mean, the grief of losing RBG, but also what's in front of us, right, as a country. And I guess you're going through all the different political machinations. And back when Obama was president and the Democrats controlled the Senate, would have that been a better time for her to step down, even though she was still going 100 miles an hour? I mean, I don't know if they think, do justices think in this way? Do they? I just don't know what goes through their head, if it's completely apolitical or they look at their time in history,
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, I think nowadays they certainly do think that way. And I remember reading it during the Obama years, there were several prominent law professors like Randall Kennedy at Harvard, who's a former Marshall clerk, and Edwin Chemerinsky Berkeley. They wrote op-eds saying that she should step down to make sure that Obama would get to name her replacement rather than whoever was going to be the Republican who ran in 2016, because you can't take that risk with the court that, has been more conservative than the country for a long time now. And they suggested that it was selfish of her to stay on. And I remember reading those things and I bristled, and I sort of was put off by them while knowing that they had a point. But because of my personal connection, I sort of, my instinctive reaction was defensive for her, and as other people have said, nobody tells Ruth what to do. It's like the line from Dirty Dancing: nobody puts baby in the corner. She was going 100%. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is her husband Marty died in 2010. At that point, the court was everything. It was always, obviously most everything. But when she had Marty, she also had her companion that she could go on vacation with, go on trips, go, come to Tanglewood up here and stuff like that. But without Marty, maybe she thought, well, I'll just devote myself 100% to work. And I think, like 99% of the world, she fully expected that Hillary Clinton would be elected in 2016. And so she, and this is not any confidence that she shared with me, I'm speculating. I think she figured that she could, it would actually be a symbolic, cool thing if the first woman president could name her replacement. I think that's something that I think I might have read that in an interview with Nina Totenberg or something. So I think all these things were factors, but at the end of the day, if you look at it just as a cold sort of political question or strategic question, she took a risk, and unfortunately, she lost the bet because she didn't make it in time. But I was thinking, I look back to see, she really would have had to step down when the Democrats still controlled the Senate, or they would have done what they did with Merrick Garland. They just would not even have voted on her replacement. So she would have had to resign. She would have had to resign in 2014 because the Republicans controlled the Senate the last 2 years of Obama's presidency. So 6 years ago, still 81 would have been a natural time for her to step down. I mean, Justice Stevens did, Justice Souter did, I think, to let Obama choose their replacements, but she didn't. And also, that timing, that's, I started out talking about how she didn't become this iconic figure till really around 2013, I think, maybe a little bit earlier, but I think it was around then. That's when she would have had to step down. So who knows? I mean, maybe she definitely started to enjoy that status and if you think about it, aside from losing the vote, I think that those 6 or 7 years of iconic status have touched a lot of young women's lives in a very positive way. And it's hard to discount the value of that. She's inspired a lot of people. So it's going to be tough in the next few years to see, the court likely pulling back on a lot of the things that she really valued, a lot of the whether it's reproductive rights or other things that liberals value. That's going to be tough to watch. But at the same time, I think she has been an integral part of inspiring a movement, which is really important. And had she stepped down in 2013 or 14, it might not be the case.
Mike, this is Jeff. You touched on this earlier about how she was good friends with Scalia. And, it's interesting because, as you note, they were opposed on just about every ideological ground you could come up with. How do you think she was able to maintain, that sort of friendship? I mean, obviously, we're living in a pretty divisive time now, and it's hard to see how two people in those roles specifically with such divergent views. I mean, Scalia, by all accounts, is a very charming man, but nevertheless, or was, I should say.
Yeah, he was good company.
I remember for Colorado's first female judge. out here on the federal bench. And she would always say Scalia was the sort, she would sit next to him at judicial functions because he'd always follow up with a note, and he was very witty.
Yeah, like I said, he made her laugh, and Marty could make her laugh. Nobody else could. Those were the two people in her life I think could really make her laugh. And if you're a serious person and he's one of two people in your life that can make you laugh, that's important. And they share the love of opera. They share the love of language. They share a love of the law. Even though to me his theories are just cockamamie and complete nonsense, he was a brilliant writer. I mean, brilliant writer, and entertaining. When I clerked on the Supreme Court with Justice Marshall, there was this tradition that you get to go to lunch with the other justices, just so you get to know them a little bit. And with Justice Scalia, he'd always want to go to this pizza place called Avi Ristorante. I don't know if any old timers know this dive place, old school red and white checkered tablecloths. And you eat a pizza, and he'd order a bottle of wine in the middle of the day, because that's what you did. You had pizza with wine. You didn't have it with beer if you're Italian American. And he would just regale us with stories, and he and Justice Marshall rarely voted together, but I could see the charm. It's interesting too. The other thing, so that relationship is famous, but I remember when I clerked for her 88 to 89, it was just after Robert Bork, who also sat on the DC Circuit, was rejected for the Supreme Court. And I remember her thinking that was just so unfair and that he deserved to be on the Supreme Court. And Bork, if anything, was even more conservative than Scalia, because at least Scalia is, liberal on some Fourth Amendment issues, some First Amendment issues. Bork, man, that guy was off the charts conservative. Or maybe not by today's lights, but for back then he was. But he was a really smart guy, and she really liked him. I don't know. She had, I disagree with her on some of this stuff. I think she had this notion, at least back then, that it should just be the smartest people on the court, and everything will turn out right. I think she's no longer held to that view over the last 10 years, since she really did want, Joe Biden to pick her replacement, not just some smart person that Trump would pick. But I don't know. I can't compartmentalize that well. I mean, I've got friends who are Republicans, but not my best friends. If we don't share basic values, I just have a hard time. But she didn't. She could compartmentalize.
Hey, Mike, great to see you. Thanks for doing this. Curious about the dissenting role that she played in many, throughout her term. We're going to have to learn, or the liberal side is going to have to learn to play the dissenting role. What did we learn from her about how to use the power of the dissent to make a difference?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because it reminded me of something I wanted to say, and I think it goes to your question. Dissents. So for those who are really not familiar with the way the Supreme Court works, there's a majority opinion, which represents the ruling of the court. But then if you don't agree with the majority opinion, you can write your own opinion, which is called a dissent, because you're dissenting from the ruling of the court. Or if you agree with it, but you have different reasoning, you write what's called a concurrence. So she, it's a conservative court, and she wrote a lot of dissents. And I think the way she looked at dissents was not just to be an expression of what she thought the law should be, but also as setting guideposts for a future court. So when they confront the same or similar issues, they could look at her reasoning and her dissent, and maybe use that as the basis for going in a different direction when they had the votes. So that's one purpose. Another purpose, I think, is famously exemplified by her dissent in the Ledbetter case. So this was a a gender discrimination place where a worker, Lily Ledbetter, learned that she was being paid much less than men who occupied the same position in her company, and she sued. And the company said, well, you sued too late. There's a statute of limitations, meaning you have to sue within, I don't remember what it was, 2 years or 5 years. And she brought suit way after the discrimination had occurred. And Lily Ledbetter said, well, I didn't know that I was being paid less until, long after the fact of the discrimination. But the court said, nope, the statute of limitations starts to run when the discrimination occurs. So when she got that paycheck, at 60% or whatever it was of her male coworkers in the same level, that's when the clock starts running on when she needs to file. Since she didn't file, she's out. And Ginsburg wrote this dissent that basically said how ridiculous this is. You can't start the clock when someone doesn't know that she's suffering discrimination and doesn't have any reason that she would know. But then what she did in a very pointed way was say, look, Congress, this is your law that the court is misinterpreting. You can fix it. You should fix it. And they did. Fortunately, I think because I think the Democrats control both House and Congress. Yeah, because I think this was 2013. I could be wrong about that. But anyway, so that's another thing. Like if you signal to the legislative branch, you can fix this problem that the court has made. And so that's another role. And then the other thing, I think that's sort of less formal in a way, and this may be one of the reasons that she started to achieve iconic status was, I think it was around that same time, 2012, 2013, that she started to read a summary of some of her dissents from the bench. So, all the Supreme Court's work is done in writing. It delivers its opinions in writing. But there's this formality of when they hand down decisions, they read, the author of the majority opinion will read a short summary of what the case was about and what the holding was. It's just sort of a ritual because it means nothing. The operative language is all in the written opinion. And usually the dissenters don't read the dissent unless they want to make like a big public statement to try to draw public attention to the issue. And she started doing that much more frequently around 2012, 2013. And I think that contributed to her elevation in the public eye. And I think she did it for the purpose of drawing more attention to some of the things that she thought were really damaging that the court was doing, like gutting the Voting Rights Act. I don't want to get too far afield from answering your question, but the Voting Rights Act, was this law put in place in the 60s to prevent states that has historically discriminated against blacks in voting rights by having, poll taxes or literacy tests, things that were clearly not only having a disproportionate impact on black voters, but designed to keep them from voting. So those states that had that history would have to get what's called pre-clearance from a court to make any changes to their voting rights laws. And the court, I think this was 2013, in his Shelby case, decided, well, these things have been in place long enough. There's really no more discrimination, so we're going to, that requirement is out. And she wrote a famous, blistering dissent, which included the line that said something to the effect that this is like throwing away your umbrella during a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. You're not getting wet because of your umbrella. You throw it away, you're going to get wet. And sure enough, since the court's ruling in that case, many, many southern states, because there's southern states for the most part, have passed laws that are severely restricting the vote for, it's having a disproportionate impact on people of color and making it much more difficult for them to vote. So she was right. She was 100% right, but it was a dissent.
Well, that's awesome. So we're at an hour. You want to take one more if it's out there?
I'm happy. I'm happy going on. I got my wife calling, but she's in a car in New York, so I'm good. Nobody's here.
All right. Well, if there's
Mike.
one more question
Mike.
out there.
Mike, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Tom.
Hi, how are you? I like the story of when, before she was a justice, she took the case, the Missouri law that allowed women to not serve on juries only because they're women. And she took that law on and won that case.
Yeah. No, that was one of them. Because it ended up that women were, and because they could get out, they did get out, and it ended up that juries were predominantly male, even though women had the right to serve on them. So
Right.
you could look at it again as a way of advantaging women because they were able to get out of jury duty. But what it meant
Right.
was that we're not serving this important civic duty, and so criminal and important civil cases were being decided mainly by men, which I thought
Exactly.
was silly.
What do you think about the idea of increasing the size of the court?
Oh, that's a good question. I've been largely against that idea because I think it's illegitimate. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the Supreme Court will have 9 justices. It's up to Congress to decide how many justices are. So there have been as few as I think 5 and as many as 10. It's been at 9 since I think the 1860s or 70s. So it feels like that's the way it's supposed to be, but it's not written in stone. And if the Democrats take both houses of Congress and Joe Biden's president, they could easily add 2, 3, 10, 20, however many they want. They have the right to do that. And so I've been against it because I think I have thought that would backfire. That the public would perceive that as politicizing the court, and it would lead to this, never-ending court packing where when the Republicans then took both houses of Congress and had the presidency, they'd add 3 more justices. And then when the Democrats got it, so we'd suddenly have a Supreme Court of, 50 people, which would make no sense.
A larger court gives, it would be less likely when there's a death that everything changes.
Yeah, no, that's true. And it would certainly be able to be more representative. And, I think now given the hypocrisy that the Republicans have demonstrated in preventing Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland, from even getting a vote in 2016, and saying, well, that's because it's a presidential election year, and we should let the next president decide, and that gives the people a voice. And now just saying, oh no, that doesn't apply when the Senate's controlled by the same party as the president. Like that's some kind of a rule. I mean, it's just nonsense. Look, they can do this. There's nothing illegal about what they're doing. There's nothing illegitimate about what they're doing. It's certainly a violation of norms, and it's certainly just rank hypocrisy. So, if they just said, hey, we got the power, we had the power in 2016 to stop Obama, we have the power now to force somebody through, I don't say, yeah, they're right. They do. They have the power. And if the public's fine with that, then they'll get voted back into office. But if the public's not fine with that, which polls show it's not, then they're probably hurting themselves at the polls. But I still fear, even though I don't like the prospect of a largely 6-3 split now in favor of the conservatives on the court, I still fear that it would be a tough sell. Franklin Delano Roosevelt floated this idea of packing the court during the New Deal because the court kept striking down New Deal legislation that he thought was necessary to get the country back on its feet. But it met with vehement opposition, including within his own party. And so I don't think the Democrats would necessarily oppose it so vehemently now, but The public might. I don't know. I don't know. That's a tough one.
Mike, what about term limits on judges? Why is that not front and center of any discussion?
Well, Pete Buttigieg made that as like a campaign platform, which I thought was silly as a campaign platform, but it's not a bad idea. But you need a constitutional amendment. That's the problem, because the Constitution says it's a lifetime appointment.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say how many people need to be on the court, but federal judges are a lifetime appointment. It's right there in Article 3 of the Constitution. And I forget when the last time we passed a constitutional amendment was. It was a while ago. So it's just not likely to happen anytime soon. I don't think if we got a question from a current student. Come on, somebody's got to be brave enough to ask me a question.
Is there one undergrad out there that wants to ask a question?
Wait, I know what I'm going to get. Beata, are you still there? I saw you earlier. Maybe she dropped off. All right, I don't want to embarrass her.
Well, I think we have good grounds for further conversations at our next Fat Cat banquet.
Yeah. Hopefully next year.
I know. But this has been awesome, Mike. Thank you so much. And yeah, just the love that you shared from your experience with her is just, it's amazing, and I think that's like the things that we all really cherish about awesome experiences and relationships with people. And you got to have that with probably one of the smartest people ever known. I'm jealous.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing a little bit with us. And I appreciate you taking the time, and thanks for everybody for signing in and joining us and taking part. And hopefully we'll offer up some more chances for us all to get together and chat more at some point soon. So thanks a lot, everybody.
Yeah, this was fun.
Awesome. Thanks,
I
Craig.
appreciate
Thanks,
the
Mike.
opportunity to share it with you all, because otherwise it just sits in me, and I like sharing it because